Hello, everyone. I think we've got quite a number of people who've joined us already. Still a few more coming in. The numbers are going up pretty rapidly, 67 and counting. Hopefully you can hear us all really well. I just want to welcome you to this event. My name is Anand. I'm a BBC journalist, and welcome to this Agile Rabbit event. This is taking place in partnership with SWEEP, which is the Southwest Partnership for Environmental and Economic Prosperity. We'll be diving into tonight's theme, and that's the health benefits of natural environments in the Southwest. We will make time at the end for your questions to our speakers. So if you have a question as we go along, just pop it in the chat and we'll keep track of those questions and try to get to them towards the end of our discussion. Just before I introduce our speakers tonight, I just want to draw your attention to a very quick, very simple poll. So if you could just have a look at that, fill it in at your leisure. It's fairly quick. That will just be there. And if you could do that, that'd be great. We're just going to repeat it right at the very end. Very simple poll. Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers tonight. We've got Dr. Ben Wheeler, who's a senior research fellow at SWEEP. He studied environmental science and social medicine, so very relevant to what we're talking about tonight. He's worked in the UK and New Zealand and has informed health policy, environmental and health policy from Cornwall, so very regional, to natural England, very national, all the way to the World Health Organization. Welcome, Ben. We've also got Luke Pollard. He's the Labour and Cooperative Member of Parliament for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, also the Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So welcome to you, Luke. Emily Stevenson is a marine biologist. She's co-founder of the award-winning social enterprise Beach Guardian, which she'll be telling us about. And she's been studying the link between microplastics and antibiotic resistant bacteria. She also takes part in a youth engagement group for the G7 on climate and environment policy. So welcome to Emily. We've got Dr. Jonathan Reeves there in the dark blue shirt. He's Principal Research Officer on Health and Wellbeing for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. Now, he's worked as a microbiologist and now in conservation, and is involved in something called Blue Prescriptions, which again, I'm sure he'll tell us about that. And finally, let me introduce Beth Collier. Beth is a nature-allied psychotherapist. I had to teach myself what this was about, and Beth will inform us about that. She's going to explain that, and she's also written about race and access to green spaces. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to our audience. I thought that since we're talking about people and nature, I know we're going to talk about science, we're going to talk about policy, but I just wondered if I could get each of you really briefly to tell me the one place where you find peace and restoration. Just a couple of sentences, if you don't mind. For me, it's the allotment. It's the place where I can go both to find solitude, but also to socialize when I'm lonely. And it's been a great saving grace over COVID. So if I could just start with you, Emily, what's your special place?
Well, my special place is a beach called Trevone Bay. I love any kind of coastal environment where you're perfectly at the interface between land and sea. And when you look out to sea, you know that all of the stresses happening in your life are right behind you, and you're just looking out, and it's beautiful.
Ben, what about you?
I'm afraid I have a very similar favourite place. For the last 10 years, I've been lucky enough to live here on the coast in Cornwall. So it is just a walk down to the local cove and sit on a rock and watch the waves come in.
Beth, what about you?
For me, it's woodlands. I love listening to the community of sounds and watching the activity around me, the birds, listening to the wind in the trees, and just the peace and the calm and the sense of belonging that I get from those spaces.
Luke?
I think you lot should get into the sea, because for me, the place that I find most relaxing and interesting is actually when I'm wild swimming in Plymouth Sound. And so don't just stay on the beach. Get yourself into the water. You can wear a wetsuit. You can bob around for a little bit. It's amazing. And we're so lucky in the Southwest that we've got this amazing coastline all around us. And going for a swim in the sea all year round is like a factory reset. It's incredible. So definitely worth doing.
A challenge for all of us. Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah, I live in Bristol, so my secret spot is the River Avon. So anybody knows, sort of Bristol is a place, Avon Valley, where there's a spot where you can look down on the river, see it meandering around. And I always try to go there at least once a year, once a season, because it changes so readily throughout the seasons, and it's a really great spot.
Okay, so coast, woodland, river, fantastic. Let's talk about the science behind health and nature. And Ben, you look at social medicine and environmental science. So what is the evidence? And is there strong, hard evidence that holds up to scrutiny that being in nature actually has physical health benefits?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think over particularly the last 10 years, people have been studying this for a long time and been thinking about it for thousands of years. But for the last 10 years particularly, there's been a real acceleration in the amount of evidence that we have. Some of it is pretty solid now. I think we have pretty good evidence around people's interactions with nature, and particularly things like stress reduction, cognitive function support, and opportunities for physical activity. There are other sort of routes to health and well-being that we're perhaps less sure about. So we have some evidence on sufficient vitamin D or immune system regulation. So those parts of the science are still pretty nascent, but I'd say we've got a pretty good body of evidence now that's really accumulated, especially for the last 10 years or so.
And it holds up when you control for genetics, for lifestyle, all of those things?
Mostly, I would say. I think the genetics thing is interesting. I think there's some research starting to come out now looking at genes and environment, trying to look at that real cause and effect. And it's kind of pointing in the right direction. Obviously, doing these kind of studies is really difficult compared to, comparing whether drug A works better than drug B, because humans out in the environment don't really sort of work well in lab kind of conditions. So we have to do the science from all different kinds of perspectives, natural sciences, social sciences, health sciences, bring it all together and try to understand these really complex kind of interconnections.
Oh, sorry, who was that? Is that someone coming in? Sorry, Jonathan, let me come to you. You're on mute, so I want you to just unmute yourself so we're sure to hear you. You're also researching health and well-being, and you're working with the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. What's the evidence? Again, hard physical evidence. How does being in nature actually benefit us?
Yeah, so some of the research that we've done has been centered around our senses, I guess. So with Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, we own and manage 10 different sites throughout the UK. So we have this quite unique position in which we're receiving lots of people throughout the year coming to work for obviously see lots of wildlife and have a good time, but at the same time, there's lots of wellbeing benefits there as well. And one of the sort of key bits of evidence that we've been working on recently is around this idea of green prescribing and blue prescribing. So we've done, for example, pilot research around what we call a blue prescription. This was 6 weeks of a nature engagement activity with working with people with experiencing mental health problems. And so what we were trying to do there is to really try and work out how sites like our sites, but also green and blue spaces in general, can be operationalized to improve mental health. And what we did there was we did sort of 6 weeks of engagement, and we measured different things like general well-being, we measured anxiety, we measured depression, we measured things like nature connectedness as well. And we got really interesting results. We got reductions in anxiety, reductions in depression, and increases in well-being. So that's forming the evidence base from which we're using, trying to think about how we use places like wetland centres to improve health. The other side of things that we've looked at is we've used our centres. We have a centre in London, which is very urban, it's near Hammersmith, and we use that to juxtapose people who have come into the centre and put them in the urban environment versus the wetland environment, and use some sort of techie whizzy gadgets measuring brain waves and heart rates and things like that. And through that, we've also measured like physiological improvements to health as well. The other side of things is we've used qualitative data. So we've asked our visitors why people come and the benefits they get, and we see broad range health benefits that way as well. Okay,
so physiological benefits as well as mental health. Beth, let me bring you in, because again, this is something you deal with. You deal with well-being, mental health, and nature. What would you say is the evidence that being in nature does impact our health and well-being, or perhaps the flip side of that, not having access also impacts us?
I think there's fantastic evidence coming from the world of neuroscience about a very real physiological impact of nature on our well-being, whether it's research from the University of Stanford that shows that a 90-minute walk in nature calms the area of our brain responsible when we're ruminating. So it really gives credence to that sense of going for a walk to clear our minds. But as well as the neuroscience, we also have a relational benefit with the natural world. That nature, just like our family and friends, is very important to our sense of well-being. And if we don't have relationship with nature, then our health and well-being is going to suffer. Whether or not that's conscious, the impact of the loss of nature in our lives will be felt.
There are other things Ben mentioned in one of the reports by Sweep, which is things like exercise, clean air, social connection, but also really, immediate things like blood pressure, weight, and even implications for people who have diabetes. Is that too far a conclusion to come to, that when we're in nature, we can have an impact on those conditions?
I don't think it's too far a conclusion. I think the evidence that we have for those very specific sort of physiological outcomes is a bit more scarce than perhaps the more general outcomes, but it's definitely growing a lot. And I always kind of try and still relate this to things like air pollution. Even though we've been amassing data and evidence, especially over the last 10 years, if you compare what the evidence is that we have on nature and health, it's still kind of a fraction of the amount of work that we do on something like air pollution. We tend to be much better at doing science and thinking about things that are risky, because we tend to focus our efforts on risk, and that's clearly really important. But the science to study the benefits of these kind of environmental exposures is really catching up fast. But yeah, getting to those specific health outcomes, lots of the evidence points in the right direction and it's positive, but we've still got a way to go before we have that massive evidence that says this is incontrovertible.
Well, you mentioned pollution, and Emily, you've been working on the impact of pollution on health at the University of Exeter. What does your research tell you?
Yeah, thanks, Anu. So my research is investigating whether microplastics, obviously one of the most prevalent and pervasive pollutants in the environment, is acting as like a vector, a carrier for potentially disease-causing organisms. Specifically, I'm looking at bacteria, and also I'm looking at whether, for example, the bacteria on microplastics is potentially harder to treat with antibiotics. As we know, one of the most pressing threats to human health is this resistance, this inability to treat some of the most common infections with lifeline antibiotics. So we're very much in the preliminary stages of research at the moment. I've literally only just started my PhD, but for my master's work, we were beginning to see that actually potentially there was some selective colonization of disease-causing organisms on different plastics that may be exposing human populations to some of these organisms. So it's really concerning, especially because they're on these microplastics, which can travel further than any kind of other natural material in the environment. So it's a great concern.
I happened to have lived and worked in India for a long time and saw some pretty awful problems with antibiotic resistant bacteria on children's health, babies. So I can imagine that would have a lot of implications. Luke, let me bring you in. You're the MP. I want to get an idea of how policy people, town planners, how do you define a green space? I mean, is there a minimum standard? Is there like a minimum definition when you're thinking about green space and access to nature?
I think there probably is in the wealth of planning documents that local councils have and that developers can plug into. But I think we've kind of we've lost sight, I think, about what is a good green space. Because I think all too frequently there is bits of dotted around a green space, but actually I think we need to go much further than that and actually have properly accessible
Luke, we're losing you slightly. We're losing you slightly to the vagaries of Wi-Fi. Let's see if you're back with us. I might get you to turn off your video just for a moment to see if that helps.
It's interaction with wildlife, with nature at scale, accessible to everyone.
I think we're having
I'll give it a go. We need better quality green space is what I'm basically trying to say. Right. And that means not just little corners of grass. That means proper tree planting, proper interaction with nature, proper biodiversity, not just a little pond in a corner that gets bogged up, but proper interaction with blue-green along the way. And I think that means that instead of just having a corner of developments or a little bit of park that's available, we need to have publicly accessible green space within the National Trust are campaigning for within 10 minutes walk of where everybody in the country lives. Whether that's 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 12 minutes, I think that vision of proper green space, proper blue-green interactive space, I think is really quite powerful. And it's something that goes above and beyond some of the restrictions and the kind of like bean counting that we sometimes get on new developments of, yes, we've just got a biodiversity net gain because we've planted an extra tree that is about 30 centimeters tall, and that's okay. Well, let's build genuine spaces that make people happy and that builds nature into our daily lives. And if we do that, I think we'll have a huge public health benefit. It will save the taxpayer tons of money, make us all happier and healthier. I can't see a downside.
Okay, well, you're promising us loads there, Luke. We're going to need to delve into what you're doing and what can be done. Let's talk about access. I mean, first of all, I just wonder, are those of you who work in this field, in the science part of it or the well-being, are you surprised that there isn't a defined idea of what green space is, or do you have a suggestion for what that should be?
I might just start on that. I think there are some definitions around, but I think that's part of the problem. There are a bunch of different definitions and lots of them are not very clear. I worked a bit with the WHO European region a few years ago. There was a whole group of us trying to come up with what's a reasonable indicator of green space kind of accessibility for cities, and came up with this distance of 300 meters, which is similar to that National Trust 10-minute walk. And there's kind of an indicator, at least. There are some standards that have been produced. In fact, there's work going on right now by Natural England developing new green infrastructure standards. And so evidence has been pouring into that. But I think Luke makes a really good point that those standards that are just based on fairly simple distance and quantity metrics only tell a tiny fraction of what the real important stuff is. And those issues about qualities, about what's there, who feels safe there, who's it for, what kind of environments do we provide for different kinds of people who have different kinds of needs and desires, all of those richer, thicker questions are really quite difficult to tackle with those kind of standards.
So if we are saying that there is evidence and it does tell us that there is a real connection between spending time in nature and better health, what is the view of each of you? Do you feel that we are connected enough to nature? Jonathan and Ben, if I could start with you in terms of like what the research says in this country, have we got enough access? Are we spending enough time in nature? Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, in terms of are we spending enough time in nature? Have we got enough of it? You'd probably say no, for example. Well, one way we can think about that is, I think parks in the UK, they're supposed to be servicing 2,000 people each. But in places like Clapham, you've got 17,000 people using a green space. So in terms of is there enough? There probably isn't, and are we connected to it enough? It's difficult to say, really. There's been a lot of discussion about, are we disconnected from nature or not? Is that happening too much, too readily? And it's a very difficult question to answer because we don't have those records through time, through connection. We can say a lot about how much species we've lost over time, but in terms of our connections, it's often things like how many words we've lost in the dictionary that nature-based, how much time children are spending. So I mean, I definitely say that we could be more connected, and the benefits there through that connection and then through health, but in much broader senses as well. So I'd say there's definitely room for improvement.
Well, Ben, I know you've got stuff to say, but I also want to just invite Emily and Beth to come in, because I know, Beth, you're in London, so you're experiencing that kind of urban conflict between, the city and some kind of nature. And Emily, obviously you've worked a lot with youth, but Beth, let me start with you. Are we spending enough time in nature?
I think it really varies. Different demographics, different communities have different relationships with nature and different opportunities for access to the natural world. People of colour spend less time in nature than white communities, and there's a myriad of reasons why, and consequently there are health disparities because of that. Not just people of colour, but also those on low incomes, those from a working class background, experience barriers that white middle classes don't. So that there is work to do to make sure that everyone feels safe and belonging in natural spaces, that these spaces are for everybody. And as a consequence of different historical legacies, there's been a process of disenfranchisement for a lot of people, to the extent where nature isn't a normal part of everyday life. So there is some reparative work to do in our individual personal relationships with nature. There are many people in urban cities that still haven't had experiences of stepping into the habitats that we all talked about enjoying, whether it's the coast, whether it's the woodlands. So they don't know that being in the sea, being in the woods feels good. They don't have that direct relationship to know, I'm not feeling great, I'm going to take myself for a walk. So we need to repair and build a bridge back into the natural world so that people can make that connection, that it's an emotionally supportive space. And that isn't something that currently everybody has personal experience of.
Well, I can see a lot of you nodding, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what you're talking about, Beth, in terms of race and access and socioeconomic status. But I'm a little surprised to hear this, because, I mean, the UK, England is one of those places where it feels like there's such an emphasis on public access to fields and parks and, woods and things like that. So it feels a little bit surprising that we have this disparity. And Ben, I just wonder if you could just give us a little bit of a primer here, yardstick. When you look at research, can connectedness to nature actually be measured? Are we talking about something that's real here, or is this just all anecdotal?
It's definitely not anecdotal, it's definitely measurable. I mean, what it actually is quite difficult to pin down, but there has been sort of work done to develop measures of nature connectedness and to actually try and quantify that sort of with large national surveys to actually try and establish how connected to nature people feel. And obviously that doesn't only arise through taking a walk in the park or going and visiting the countryside, it's also watching wildlife documentaries, it's reading books, it's all the different ways that people engage with natural environments can feed into how connected we feel to that nature. But it is definitely a measurable kind of construct, and there are lots of groups around the country and internationally working on that sort of connection, I guess, between nature connection, nature experience, and health and well-being outcomes. Emily,
what about with young people? I know over COVID, and we'll talk a little bit about COVID separately, but my pre-teenagers were just inside, and it has slightly rewired their whole relationship with being outside, being face to face. But what would you say about young people being out in nature? Are they naturally engaging with the outside environment, or do you find that they're reluctant?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first is one of the greatest concerns that we kind of experience with the work that we do at Beach Guardian, engaging with school children and visiting schools to connect young people with the environment, is that we have this huge kind of wave of an issue with eco-anxiety amongst young people. It's not only this kind of fear of inheriting a damaged planet, but a fear of not knowing what they can do or if they can do anything. So I think that is a real issue that we're facing, is not just kind of access to green spaces or disparity between access to green and blue spaces, but actually young people feeling they're already disconnected from these spaces because they're already doomed. This is really what we're kind of experiencing. One thing, you're saying it's surprising to see this disparity between people and planet here in the UK or in Cornwall. It's even more surprising to hear that there are young people in the schools here that have never set foot on a beach. And in Cornwall, you can never be more than half an hour from a beach. So what we really need to see is this accessibility to natural spaces for young people, to not only obviously provide the mental health and well-being benefits that we're all talking about, but the mental health and well-being benefits to combat this eco-anxiety amongst young people.
That is really stark, because the Southwest, we're the largest region in England, and we have the longest coastline of any English region. So to hear that there are children in Cornwall who haven't set foot on the beach. Beth, I want to talk about race, access to green space, whether it's race really or socioeconomic factors. And one thing that was surprising, and I'd love to hear from all of you on this, is that the government, Black and Asian people visit green spaces in smaller percentages than white people, about 26% roughly, as compared to around 44%. So, fairly big gap there. And the other thing that's really interesting, Luke, I think for me, this was interesting, and I wonder, from a policy point of view, this isn't just limited to London, Manchester, Birmingham. There's a map that Friends of the Earth have created, which looks at race and access to green spaces. And where you get larger populations of non-white people, you have much poorer access to green space. And so if you hover over Exeter, Bristol, Plymouth, you see these red parts of the map where people are not being able to access green space as much as other people. So I want to talk about this, and I wonder, Beth, if you can start. Why? You mentioned a lot of things about why this happens, but can you explain some of the factors why it is that race actually means fewer Black and Asian people go out into nature?
Yes, I mean, particularly given in our countries of heritage, we're often deeply connected to the natural world, but something seems to happen when we come to the West. There's a disconnect. And part of that is about our experiences on migration, whether that's 2-3 generations ago, and encountering racism and hostility in cities where we tended to gather together for support networks and a sense of safety in numbers. Racism is intimidating enough when you're surrounded by other people of colour, but the idea of being more remote or more isolated it's a very frightening concept. So generationally, there was a sense of wanting to protect younger generations from hostility, and the sense of don't go there, it's not for us. And over time, there becomes a generational disconnect. We're not taken into nature. It isn't part of our normal everyday lives.
Can I just ask you, because part of what you've done is to kind of go and speak to people in BAME communities about the reasons. So this isn't necessarily your view, this is what you've heard.
I'm an ethnographic researcher, yeah. So this is based on an in-depth ethnographic research into people of colour's relationship with nature, which is currently being published as chapters by both Springer and Bloomsbury.
And what I wanted to ask you, just on with that context, is, I mean, that feels a little bit like an own goal. Like when you have these, I don't know if you have these conversations, but do you feel that those reasons have endured, or is it that we just need to, remove those barriers, and actually Black and Asian people will feel more comfortable? I mean, is there still a reason why they feel uncomfortable? In other words, is it historical or is it current?
Yeah, so what I'm describing is a combination of historical experience, historical legacy, and also direct personal experience. So that's just one of many reasons that our elders on arrival. In addition, there's also the stigma from colonialism and slavery that Black people are backwards in association with nature. We come from underdeveloped villages that we live close to nature, and that being a negative, whereas in the West, in a middle class lifestyle, being close to nature is presented as positive. In terms of who are the best custodians of nature, there's a narrative that's developed that Black people harm nature or don't understand nature, whilst white communities and environmentalists have often appropriated traditional ecological knowledge to present themselves as the better custodians. So there's a real depth of history around stigmatizing Black connection to nature. And on coming to the West, we encountered hostility in not just in cities, but also in going to more remote areas. And what happens is we tend to focus on where we feel safe and being successful in those spaces, so that what we see is an allegiance to the city and the culture of the city and being successful in those spaces. In the countries of heritage, we tended to learn about nature through an oral tradition, through elders. On coming to the West, our elders perhaps didn't have knowledge about nature here in the UK to pass on, which is another reason a disconnect is created. So there are many different reasons which come together to mean a focus becomes more orientated to urban areas where we feel a stronger sense of safety, and there's a generational loss of connection to nature.
So it's quite complex, but if I can bring the rest of you in, if we then move this forward and say, we are saying that there are health risks or health benefits, to being in nature. You've got significant populations of non-white people who aren't being in nature. How do we get around that? What are some of the solutions, or what is some of the evidence? What works? I just wonder if I can start with you, Luke. I mean, in the place, in your own constituency, do you see this as being an issue? Please be honest. I mean, this isn't London, but do you see that there are issues around race and access to green spaces?
Yes, there's huge issues about inequalities and access to nature. And if you come from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic community, you're much more likely to live in an urban environment, and you're much more likely to live in a nature depleted urban environment. And I think it's making the distinction, because sometimes we can use a very broad brush that suggests that rural communities are all living in a nature abundant environment just because it's greener, and urban communities live in a nature deprived. Well, that's not necessarily always the case. But when you look within those communities, then you can certainly get a stronger sense of the inequalities around it.
Okay, and if there are inequalities, and you as an MP working with local councils, etc., are having to deal with a finite pot of money, which at the moment in the UK is, needed for healthcare. It's needed for adult social care. We have, a dearth of affordable housing. Does this kind of inequality, or the access to green space, even make it onto the policy priorities?
It doesn't of the current government, no. And I think after 11 years of austerity, many of the programs that had a deliberate attempt to incorporate communities with nature have been lost. However, I think there's a real opportunity to restore that. And I think there's an agenda which I think is emerging about a right to nature. Just as you have a right to clean air starting to come up, especially after some of the appalling air quality tragedies that we've seen, especially in our big cities, a right to nature, I think, speaks really profoundly to some of the 10 by 10 work that's coming out. And if you haven't seen 10 by 10, it's what are the 10 things that a child should have experienced by the age of 10 years old. Now, that's not sticking in more maths and science into the curriculum. What it's saying is, you should have the opportunity to learn a musical instrument. But importantly for this conversation, one of those things should be you should have access, you should have been to the countryside, and you should have been to the coast. Because it's not just about the physical benefits of being in the environment, it's about expanding horizons quite considerably. Because I represent a small city, as an example, 50% of our kids haven't been to a beach, and 20% of our kids who live in Britain's ocean city, as we brand ourselves, have never seen the sea. So the inequalities are profound, and it will take structural interventions to get in there. But I think when we're talking about access to nature, we risk always coming from a very middle-class frame on it. Certainly, quite a lot of the academic and intellectual and political debate is very much kind of like, just put on your walking boots, drive into the countryside, and ta-da, you're there. Well, if you don't have access to private transport, if you don't have a tradition of doing so, if you haven't experienced that, and if you have an anxiety about what equipment and stuff you need, then that makes that interaction with nature, be it blue or green, incredibly difficult. But we do need this to be on the public policy agenda, because if it is, then you'll start seeing real benefits, both in education, in health, in life chances and opportunities, delivering huge tangible and measurable financial gains, let alone improvements in everyone's well-being, which is pretty important as well. So we do need it on agenda. It's not there yet.
Thank you, Luke. Emily, I could see you nodding your head. I will come to you in a second, but I also just want to bring up, Jonathan, you were talking about the blue prescription. So basically this is organizing for people who are dealing with mental health issues to actually spend time, isn't it, in, for example, wetland. Just give me an idea what it looks like. What is a blue prescription?
Well, it's very similar to a group. So the broader area is obviously green prescribing. So that's the idea of getting people into green and blue spaces for mental health. And so, it can come through a number of routes. It's often being formalized by NHS services at the moment as a very formal route by how you can deal with mental health issues. But at the same time, there's often routes by for self-referral and going into the community. And that's what I wanted to pick up on a bit, actually, where you're saying about how we can fill these gaps in inequalities. And, green and blue prescribing could be one of those areas, because often it's people that aren't engaging with health services are probably similar, they're also not engaging with the with green and blue spaces as well. So, and then what else can happen is that obviously organizations like ourselves and all those other folk that are doing green and blue prescribing, you can be going into communities and changing the landscape a bit, so making it so that the places, green and blue spaces are more accessible to people of colour, perhaps where they weren't before. And as Beth was alluding to earlier, the conversations that we've had with communities in and around Bristol is, it flags up all of those things. They experience racism. If they go to a more affluent area of Bristol, which is Clifton, they report experiencing racism. Safety issues are a big concern in their local parks, because they're just not very well maintained. And also it's just not for them. They go to these places and they don't see people that look like them, they see people that look like me. So, it just doesn't feel very welcoming. So what green and blue prescribing can be is that conduit to which we can start breaking some of those barriers down. It's obviously very formalized in that it's structured around this 6-week access to nature is the kind of idea. But from that, you can spiral out into other different ways in which you can engage people.
When you use that word prescribing, let me ask all of you this. I mean, are we talking about the GP telling you, I think you need to spend some time in nature? Are we talking about, NHS funding to help people with their mental health and say, we're going to organize an opportunity for you, for example, to spend time in a wetland or a forest, or there's going to be an activity? Is that what we're talking about?
So it does happen through that route as well. So there is quite a significant amount of NHS funding going into this. For example, there's 1,000 link workers at the moment been funded, and they'll extend to 4,500. And link workers are the people that kind of sit at the in between the GP and some of these services. So it is being formalized, but also, there's a lot of other activity that loads of other, third sector organizations are doing great work in, not going through that formalized route, but, through a lot of community engagement and trying to engage people that way as well.
Do you think, Luke, that core NHS funding should be used for access to nature? I mean, again, we're talking about, the real world here where there is an awful lot of health need. Is this something that you would advocate for?
I think core NHS funding should always go on core NHS services, but the public health budget, which should sit in parallel to the core NHS funding, which has been steadily eroded, I think has enormous potential to do this. But there's no point prescribing green and blue access unless the people have an ability to get there. And so I think sometimes we jump over a couple of steps. I think it's a great idea and we should be using more of this. But if you lack private transport, if you lack the experience of doing so, how do you interact with green and blue spaces if that's not on your doorstep naturally? And I think if we are to make a system like that work, we also then have to look at the other barriers and obstacles as to why people aren't interacting with nature on a regular basis anyway, to make that interaction work. Because it's like prescribing a drug where you don't have a pharmacy nearby to you. It might, if you do it, deliver the results, but unless you have the opportunity and the access, it won't. So it's just part of a bigger conversation.
Who's responsible for delivering that? Is it local councils? Is it the government? I mean, where would the money for that come from?
Well, the public health budget has been devolved to local councils, and so that is a local council responsibility. The problem is there's very few pennies in it, and so it does need to be part of that broader conversation about how we value preventative work as well as treatments, because I think access to nature can possibly have a bigger benefit to well-being as a preventative thing, not just a treatment thing. So if you get to the point where you're being prescribed, well, actually, we're probably missing a huge amount of opportunities for people to derive benefits, be it mental and physical health benefits from their interaction earlier. And that's why I think when we're talking about access, we've got to be talking about access from the very, from the moment someone leaves their home, how do they interact? Where are the spaces and opportunities to be able to get there? The closer you bring nature to where people already are, the more likely it is that they'll interact and derive a benefit from it.
Okay, we have another 10 minutes or so to have this conversation. I just want to remind people that we're talking about the opportunities as well as the threats for how we can realize health benefits from our natural environments in the Southwest. Two more things I want to bring up, and I'd like to hear from Ben and Emily, but equally just jump in if you'd like. COVID, and also we want to talk about actual protecting of green spaces and again trying to reduce these inequalities, which we've heard from the others. But let me just ask Emily about COVID, because we heard a lot of people obviously couldn't go to work, they weren't commuting, so people were outside. There were a lot of people who were just wandering around outside, in nature. What changes did you see at Beach Guardian during COVID?
It's a fantastic question, and positives and negatives. Definitely, there were lots of amazing stories to come out of lockdowns, people reconnecting with nature again, really taking those daily walks to make sure they go outdoors and just disconnect from work and connect with the environment. That was a huge kind of, it's awful to talk about silver linings in the face of a global tragedy, but we really did begin to see this reconnection to nature. However, we have also seen a totally new and prevalent pollutant into the environment, which has become a huge negative, and that is Ppe pollution. So as soon as we headed into
pollution,
exactly, yes. The face masks, the gloves, we found all kinds of different personal protective equipment in the environment as a result of people protecting themselves, which of course you have to make sure you're protecting your own personal health and well-being, but environmental health needs to always be considered. The problem is there was no guidance on how to handle these new materials that the general public were using daily, no guidance on how to deal with the end of life. So we saw an explosion of this pollutant into the environment.
So while we had more people enjoying nature, we also had more people polluting nature, which is obviously not good. Ben, let me bring you in here, because there was this People in Nature survey by UCL, and they also looked at what happened with COVID. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, there's two separate surveys actually. One was called People in Nature. That is the survey that's run by Natural England on how people engage with natural environments. And through that, last year, they were basically able to demonstrate that I think over 90% of people who were spending their time visiting green and blue spaces said they thought it was good for their mental and physical health. And also that survey was able to track people's engagement with nature through lockdowns, less people maybe spending that time outside, people not wanting to interact with other people, and also a really important polarization of experience. Like Emily said, there was perhaps an engagement with nature and so on for some people, but for other people there was a real disengagement from nature, and perhaps unsurprisingly more prevalent amongst older people, amongst people who were already in poor health, actually much less likely to go out and visit nature than they had been previously. So a real difference of kind of experience. But then also, like you say, yeah, UCL have also been running a study called the COVID Social Study, which has been following people over time since last spring. And again, that evidence really strongly suggests that people who were able to take the time to spend time in a garden or to get activity, fresh air in their local park, tended to report much better mental health. And in sort of comparison to that, people who perhaps spent more time sort of reading the news and following social media are perhaps more likely to report worse mental health and well-being out of that. So we have all of these different kinds of things going on at the same time, and I think COVID had really just emphasized actually a lot of the kind of inequalities that we've already been discussing.
Well, Beth, let me come to you next, and Jonathan, I want to bring you in a moment, but just talking about COVID and the impact, again, most of us are in the Southwest, you're in London, if you want to chip in on that, but I'm also curious to know, hearing, what you heard after laying out the disparities and the reasons for those disparities, where do you think the answer lies? Where do you think the solutions lie to closing that gap?
So lots of things to pick up on there. I mean, one is also just to highlight the disparities, not just in presence in nature, but also participation. For example, we're talking about research. Wild in the City, the organisation that I run, has been at the fore of conducting research around not just people of colour's relationship in nature, but also well-being. But we've experienced a disparity of access, as do many Black-led organisations, in accessing funding, which has an impact on our voice and participation. And I think that's a big part of the picture of why we're less present, in terms of less representation of Black leadership, but also less representation of what the issues are for people of colour. Your other question was about how to repair sort of the disconnect.
Sorry, Beth, can we talk about solutions? I'm just aware of time.
Yeah.
But I'd like to hear what you think, where you think the responsibility lies, and what some of those solutions look like.
Solutions for us are personal and relational, and what we're really focusing on doing is rebuilding the oral tradition for learning about nature. It's one of the most powerful ways for reconnecting people with that direct personal relationship. That when people gather together, particularly as a community of people of colour, seeing leaders that look like them, feeling part of the community, learning about nature and the wildlife around us, very quickly, people will say, you were telling us about that oak tree, and I took my young niece out and was sharing that information with her. And there you see that oral tradition coming back in, where people have a sense of belonging and ownership and feel they have knowledge to share. And then that niece or nephew then has information to pass on themselves. It doesn't take long to rebuild that personal relational connection, learning from people within family, within communities. There was a time when we didn't have to go to an organisation or a book to learn about the natural world. We could go to our grandmother, we could go to our aunt, and that's the approach that we take.
Okay, I want to just have a few final questions, because we've also got a lovely long list of audience questions. So I want to talk about action, what action is being taken. Jonathan, I want to ask you first, if there's time. Emily, I'd like to get you in. What work is happening right now to manage environments and to actually increase access to them, Jonathan?
Well, as I mentioned previously, so through the Blue Prescribing program, that's one of the most active ways in which we're reaching out to different communities. But there's lots of other community engagement programs that are targeting Black and Asian minority ethnic communities as well. So there's lots of different things happening. But yeah, I don't have any off the top of my head, to be honest.
You're not here to list them out, but there are things.
Yeah.
Emily, what about you? We've got, COP26 coming. We've got a lot of young people getting involved. Do you see that there's better access? Is there work going on around that?
Yeah, so interesting when you mentioned COP26, you probably remember back in June, we had the G7. So ahead of the G7 event, I was part of the Youth 7, which is the youth engagement group for the G7. And as part of that, we've consulted with 10,000 young people across the G7 nations and across the globe. And something that we found was that amongst young people, one of the biggest kind of issues was access to information to connect with nature. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that these kind of policy concerns and priorities were then heard at the highest level of international decision making at the Leaders Summit. So we recommended, as one of our policy recommendations, that, and this is picking up on one of the comments in the chat from, I believe, Kate, we recommended that across the national curriculum, across the G7 nations, that climate and environment education is provided in schools. That point of access, that point of information, that accessibility to information from the very start of your educational journey.
Okay, Luke, two questions for you, and then we're going to go to some audience questions. So what's going on in your constituency? Are there moves to increase access to green space?
There is. And so in Plymouth, we probably have a bit greater expertise about access to blue space due to the huge amount of marine work going on. But I think many of the initiatives around ocean citizenship, for instance, ocean stewards, actually has an application to green space as well as blue space, because effectively it's about building a knowledge base and routes to help people access nature. And what we do know is that...
Can you give us an example of like how that's happening? Like, is it school outreach? Is it improving facilities?
Yeah, and so getting young people to be able to access nature is a really important part of it. And so as a really simple example, helping young people have a swimming costume rather than underwear to go to the beach in, it's a really profound effect of getting especially kids that are just on the cusp of primary, secondary education. If you go to a beach, especially in some poorer communities, you'll see lots of the kids playing around the waves in their underwear, and then they stop. Body image and other things kick in, and it makes it much harder. So the provision of swimwear, properly fitting swimwear for young people, especially in poorer communities, has a huge impact on their ability and their comfort in interacting with that marine environment and getting all the benefits from it. Thank
you. The clock is ticking. So I want to ask each of you really quickly, 1 or 2 actions you're taking personally to either protect environments or to gain health benefits from nature. Luke, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
I'm planting trees everywhere I go. I think it's really important. But when I do, it's not just broadleaf trees. I'm planting fruit trees, so you can make a better example of telling kids where their fruit comes from, not just coming from Lidl.
Okay. Beth, you do your psychotherapy in nature, so I suppose that's one example, but anything else?
Yes, so there's the examples of creating opportunities for people to experience that personal relationship with nature, but I think advocating for equality of access within the environmental field for diverse voices as well is also essential.
Okay, Ben, what about you?
Well, I guess I'm going to speak professionally, but it's also personal. I have, like everybody, I have constraints on my role, but also I have a lot of academic freedom, and I choose to work in partnership with organisations like WWT, our local authority partners, with Public Health England, and so on, in making sure that the research that we do actually is meaningful and useful, and trying to feed that research in so that the decisions that do get made have some good evidence to back them up, and that we can demonstrate the beneficial impacts of making these links between nature and health.
And Jonathan, really quickly, I know obviously you're also doing this professionally, but the stuff that you've learned abroad that could be applied in the UK, do you want to just mention that?
Yeah, so I did a couple of years ago. I went to Japan and Korea to explore forest bathing. If people are aware of that, the idea that you can sort of luxuriate in forests for health. I mean, one take home from it was a very sort of broad sweep around how they do it systemically and less about the engagement and the sort of different things you can do to, you know, calm yourself down. But I couldn't pick out one thing, but actually mindful walking was one of the best things that I did. So very slow, deliberate. Walking in a forest was exceptionally beneficial to me. Yeah, from that experience.
All right, and Emily, what about you? Any wild swimming for you?
I refuse to get in the water without a wetsuit. I'm literally the least wild swimming person ever. But I'm taking huge inspiration from what Beth was saying about oral communication, about all of these issues. I'm just going to keep talking about them.
Okay. I just need to mention again that the poll that we had right at the top, we're just going to pop that up again, and we kind of want to measure your answers now that we've had this discussion. So please just look out for the poll and go ahead and just pop your answers in there. If you would, that would be really helpful. Let's take some audience questions. So here is one from Davy Whittle. And the question is there a role or a need for technology in helping people connect with nature and improving and maintaining blue and green spaces? I don't know who feels like they can tackle that one, but if someone would like to, Ben?
I can mention at least something. I mean, one of the reports that we've done for our SWEET project is around engaging and making opportunities for young people to engage in natural spaces, whether that's urban parks and so on. And the evidence seems to suggest that actually providing free Wi-Fi in these kind of spaces can actually be really beneficial. And that might seem like a bit of a, you sort of think, oh, people, you know, young people should be out there engaging with nature, not sitting on their phones. But actually, if you provide those kind of services that are becoming increasingly kind of essential, really, actually provide a much more accessible, much more engaging kind of place for people to be. So that kind of stuff, I think, can be really significant.
A little counterintuitive, Wi-Fi and nature spaces, but there you go. Here's another question, specific one from Georgina Hart, who's asking, what can be done to make Peat, Bogs and Moorland better understood and used more widely for well-being purposes? I'm not a big Moorland and Peat Bog walker, but if anyone is or wants to tackle that one, please go ahead.
I don't know if I could tackle it, but I can just empathize with the challenge, because obviously we work on wetlands, which are often, you know, estuarine and in kind of in the middle of nowhere. Peat bogs and moorlands exactly the same, and immediately you've got this transport barrier, and they're often in places where people aren't. So it probably comes down to transport again. On our project, you know, we sort of pains to put a minibus in the funding so that at least you can reduce that barrier. So I mean, that's the only way. I mean, I love a peat bog and a moorland, so I would happily do it. But yeah, there's
okay, challenging. Okay, Kate Hind has a question for Luke. Luke, she asks, our local council has just asked people's opinion on making public toilets payable at point of contact, so either 30 or 50p. Do you think councils don't realize that this is going to create a massive barrier, especially in the case of teenage girls?
Yeah, it does. After 11 years of austerity, the councils don't have a lot of money left. And so quite a lot of local authorities are now borrowing against the projected income from toilets to be able to replace toilets, to make safer toilets, in particular toilets with more accessibility features. Where that's right or wrong, you can clearly hear my view on it, but it is providing toilet spaces. I think I'm really unhappy that actually access to a toilet is a really important part of everyday life for a lot of people, especially for a lot of people for whom actually accessing a toilet on a regular basis and a predictable basis it gives them the ability to leave their home or not, and to feel safe about doing so. We've got real challenges here, and we also have real challenges about where accessible toilets are in interaction with nature as well, about how that works. And so there is quite a lot of challenge to how to do it. But, you know, the politics of toilets, I'm afraid, everyone goes for a wee. So let's make it easy for everyone to go for a wee. It really is that simple.
Well, this all goes back to budgets, doesn't it? And the figures I read was, again, from Friends of the Earth, that we should be spending around 4 billion a year to increase access to green space. So you can argue over that, but that gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge. One more question I think we have time for, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Ellie Thomas is asking, what about bringing nature into the home? Could this provide similar benefits? Beth, I don't know if that's something you ever think about. I know you grew up on a small holding, so I don't know if for you, you know, home and nature were just one thing. But what about bringing nature into the home?
Yeah, I think with the recent trend for plant parenthood during COVID, where many people were enjoying having houseplants, we're getting very similar benefits to what we see when we go out into nature in the natural world. I think the more green we have around us, the better.
Okay, so whether indoor or outdoor. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but I just wanted to thank all of you. Our panel, Dr. Ben Wheeler, Luke Pollard, Emily Stevenson, Dr. Jonathan Reeves, and Beth Collier. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thanks to all of you who've tuned in. I just also want to let you know that coming up later this month on the 28th, we're going to be in Exeter, Phoenix, talking with Paul Mason about stopping fascism. Totally different topic, but very interesting nonetheless. So come along and join us. You can do that in person. You can have a chat and a drink there. But for this virtual event, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.